Hello there. Thank you very much for joining us today again. Today we're going to be focusing on really what is cloud. Now, this is a topic I'm very familiar with. I am someone that lives in this world, especially when it comes to deployments, moving and migrating large organizations into cloud environments. I've been doing so for the past, 5+ years, specifically on cloud, but then even more so, probably 10 years when talking about private cloud and a lot of these other things. Now, we'll get into what the heck those terms mean, but I definitely wanted to kind of give you a little bit understanding of kind of where I come from, right? What my background is. I've been trying to help many individuals learn and get into IT. And, we've been covering topics that are really fundamental up to now, right? We've been talking about what is a server operating system, what is virtualization. And so those are fundamental, especially as now we start talking about what is cloud. Now, each of these pieces are building blocks that enabled the rest, right? First, you had the server operating system, building block number one. Then you had virtualization, which was fundamental for changing the entire landscape of what cloud is and what it does. So that's building block number two. And then that enabled IT organizations to rethink everything. And as such, now you had new players in the market. AWS, kind of the first one out there. Then at Microsoft with their Azure platform, and then Google, not to be left behind. Now, these may be the big three here in the United States, but there's also others like Alibaba internationally. And then there's a slew of other cloud providers, which are basically organizations and businesses with their own infrastructure that all they're doing is they're sharing it with you. They're sharing it with businesses. They're sharing it with others so that they don't have to invest in the infrastructure, the hardware, the electricity, the cooling, the management, the headaches around hardware failures and everything else. They don't have to worry about that. Instead, all they have to do is pay a bill, and it's just like a utility. Right? You as perhaps the recipient or the client or the customer of a cloud provider, you get all the services without the capital investment that you would need in order to run your own data centers, your own cooling, maintain your own staff, to support and maintain those underlining infrastructure components. Instead, you kind of outsource that to someone else, right? And so in that is born the cloud concept. Now there's others. There's other businesses that kind of play a middle ground of sorts. For example, there's co-location facilities, which are basically data centers that you can rent space in, but you're still providing the hardware and everything else around it. And nowadays there's a little more mixed, but in essence, there are some differences there. So as we start looking at the cloud, it's important to understand that all these things came about because of those fundamental pieces that came about, right? When the virtualization kind of enabled all of this components. So if you didn't catch my what is virtualization video, I encourage you to check that out. You won't necessarily need it for this, but it'll help fill in some gaps for you as well. All right. So today we're going to be focusing on the cloud, right? Now, when you look up in the sky, we're not talking about like actual clouds, like what you see in my picture here. No, that's not what we're talking about. And instead, what we're talking about again is that the leveraging a computing service provided by a business and organization such as AWS, Microsoft Azure, and GCP. Those are just a few, but they happen to be some of the largest. And the idea there is that you can thus rent the usage of whatever you need to. You can build your services and you can choose whether to run your virtual machine servers in the cloud service, in the cloud provider's environment. You can store data in there. You can provide database services. You can extend your network into their environment because that's fundamental. But basically, you can rent and use any of these cloud providers' resources as if they were your own resources. And that can be very, very powerful. All right. So, and really the purpose of cloud is because these providers are much larger. They're having to provide services to thousands of their clients. As such, the management of their platforms are designed in such a way that a single business probably wouldn't go down the path of investing in themselves if it was just for themselves. Instead, these cloud providers provide a way to manage a lot of the same resources that you need to run an IT organization in a way that's faster, that's more flexible, allows organizations to quickly scale out as well as collapse in and only consume what they need, right? So one of the biggest changes in going to the cloud is that instead of you buying your own hardware, and every time you buy your own hardware, you're basically buying the capacity, the max capacity all at once up front. And then from there, it's about filling that capacity so you can get your best dollar amount or dollar usage based off your investment or your return on investment, so to speak. Instead of doing that, well, you load your services onto cloud infrastructure, and then you just pay for the compute cycles or the storage that you need. And that's a much lower cost fundamentally than you having to invest in all the infrastructure required to run all the servers, the data centers, etc. Right? So the leveraging economies of scale, because a lot of these cloud providers are able to invest heavily in their data centers and get the latest, greatest, the largest types of hardware because they're spreading that across thousands of clients. Well, all of a sudden, you can see how powerful a lot of these cloud providers have become because of that, right? And so that's where it really has been beneficial for cloud providers. But then for organizations, it's been very beneficial as well because they don't have to build out the infrastructure needed to run their data centers. Instead, what they can focus on is where should my applications run? How do I protect my applications? And it's a slightly different focus. You're not focusing so much on sort of the lowest common denominator. You're able to go up a couple scales. And when I talk about that, we'll talk about here a little bit of what those typical building blocks look like as well. Now, when I talk about like cloud providers and their data centers, that's what I'm actually talking about. Because a lot of times we think of the cloud as sort of this nebulous type of concept, but the reality is it's just virtual machines and applications and operating systems and data. Instead of it running in your physical data center or a company's data center, it's running in someone else's. And these are some examples of what those data centers look like. You have, Amazon's data centers here. You have in the lower left-hand corner, you have Microsoft's portable data center, right? So this is just an example of Microsoft's gotten really creative. So they have, yes, they have the same type of data centers that perhaps Amazon has, but they also have these compact type of trailer type of computing where they're able to invest in more creative ways to do so. Microsoft even has a data center that is underneath the ocean, right? And in order to improve cooling and so forth. So they're experimenting with different ways of computing, but it's all made possible by the fact that they're able to leverage the economies of scale to design new ways of doing the same type of things that organizations have been doing for decades. Okay. So, in addition here, I won't leave out Google with their GCP computing platform. They have the same types of data centers. These are just some examples, but for the most part, they're massive. Instead of going into an organization and maybe it has, a few rows of racks and data centers and things like that, and maybe it's spread out. We're talking about massive computing clusters. And if you look in the over here on the upper right-hand corner, you'll see how many data centers Microsoft has been able to stand up globally, as well as AWS or Azure Web Services. These are cloud providers that have invested heavily globally. And if you wanted to run a data center, or you wanted to run your application here in the United States, as well as stand it up in, let's say, South America or Africa, historically, you would have to invest. You would have to build something out of there. You would have to buy hardware, have it shipped to that location, stood up. This could take anywhere from 6 to a year or more just to get your application running in that country. With a cloud provider, you can leverage their investments and you can have your application running out there in hours, right? So this is the real benefit and strategically for organizations to start leveraging these large cloud providers so that they can scale out and provide a better level of service for their customers as well. So just kind of give you an idea of what's involved with these data centers for these cloud providers. Now, when it comes to data centers and we start talking about cloud computing models, for example, there's different ways in which a model works. And when you think of just straight Amazon or Azure or GCP, typically what we're talking about from a deployment model is that public cloud type of infrastructure. These are services that are delivered over the public internet and oftentimes are available to anyone with a credit card, so to speak. Okay. Now, there's other models of cloud that it's important for you to know. A private cloud is one where a company has invested in their own data center, and it's more than just running their virtual machines and everything else, but they've also built their own management layer on top of their infrastructure, similar to perhaps how a cloud provider would do so. In addition to that, there is this concept now known as hybrid cloud. Okay, now hybrid cloud is the most common cloud for deployment that's out there, especially when you start getting to small, medium business type of organizations, and even into those enterprise level or sized organizations. Hybrid cloud is kind of a combination of the two, where organizations will have some applications that run within their control completely, and then a portion of their computing, their applications, everything else is being stored in the cloud. Now, there's different ways that this can be done. It can be done simply for a disaster recovery scenario where an organization decides, hey, I'm going to run my primary computing in my control unless there's a disaster, in which case all these applications have to come up somewhere else. And instead of me buying my own data center to bring that stuff up, I'm going to borrow the computing from a public cloud provider. That's just one example. So, and more we're starting to see these deployment models change and evolve over time, but these are the primary three that's important for you to understand. Now, that in addition to the deployment model, it's important to understand what makes a private cloud or a public cloud, what makes these things follow a cloud definition versus just a data center or a co-location. Because a co-location is basically you're renting floor space. Maybe they provide a rack, and then you're buying hardware and you're putting your hardware there, right? So, when you start thinking about that, then it really starts talking, what we're talking about here is different types of layers. And this is a good example here of different cloud management layers that you can think of when we're talking about the differences in cloud. And I'll point out here, for example, you have things like networking, storage, servers, virtualization. A lot of these things are fundamental. Now, as you start looking at different additional tiers and what gets managed and responsibility of who manages it, that's where it starts becoming more and more about different cloud providers, what they offer, the services they offer, right? So we'll come back to this slide, but I want to go back to, and let's talk about the different cloud computing services that oftentimes you can subscribe to as a customer. The first is infrastructure as a service. And this is where all the layers of all those boxes that I mentioned, networking, storage, computing, virtualization, that's almost like the physical stuff, right? All the way up to virtualization is probably the highest that it would go. And the idea there is that you can bring your own virtual machines, right? And instead of you worrying about what hypervisors are running on or any of that underlining stuff, to you, all it appears is I need so much storage and so much processor and so much memory. So let me subscribe to that, and I'll just run the VMs that I would run on my data center, and I would run that in the cloud. As such, because the virtual machine and everything else basically looks and feels the same regardless of where it lives, you are more than likely subscribing to something called infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. Okay. And so these are resources that you can subscribe to. It's the same. You can scale them up. You can scale them down simply by a lot of times just a reboot of the virtual machine. So this was sort of the first foray or the first entry point when organizations were switching over to cloud, is that they were simply moving their virtual machines that were running on site to a cloud provider in the cloud, right? Or on their data centers, right? So cloud data center, initially it sounds the same, but then it starts to shift as we talk through these other capabilities. The next is platform as a service. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because this is where, yes, you get that infrastructure that's needed, but it kind of goes above and beyond that, right? Maybe, and really the difference here is who is managing what. If you're running your data center, you're managing all the hardware. You're managing the hypervisor. You're managing the operating system. You're managing the application. You're managing everything in front, behind, and around it. In infrastructure as a service, you're not managing the hardware pieces. All you're focused on is the operating system and what lives with those operating system environments. Perhaps you're defining virtual networking so that those virtual machines can talk to each other. But for the most part, you're not worried about having to go physically wire things up. That's being handled by someone else. As you start looking at platform as a service, however, this is where you start going up the rank a little bit, and you're sort of delegating more and more responsibility to someone else. So instead of you having to be responsible for, let's say, the operating system plus the database, a lot of times what cloud providers will do is they'll build a platform as a service solution where, don't worry about the infrastructure needed for running that database. Just focus on the database itself. Just focus on what that database is looking to contain, and we'll worry about patching the operating system, upgrading the application, the database application. We'll worry about those things. Instead, your software application that is used to web and host, that can connect to our database, for example, and you don't have to worry about what's running that. We'll protect it, we'll guard it, we'll make sure it's running. Everything else, you don't worry about it, right? The same could be done at the application level or on a web front end. And so there's different versions of these services that are now being tailor-made in order to offset and allow you to delegate more and more responsibility over an application to someone else. And more importantly, it's not just a responsibility. You're delegating risk. And that's the biggest part of this a lot of times. It's you're delegating risk. So you're not taking on the risk of your database going down and you having to support it. You're delegating that risk management to someone else. And that can be very powerful, especially when you are in a business that requires things to be up. Being able to push off and delegate some of that risk makes it very, very flexible for you and puts you in a lot more control. Now, that's not always the case, but in general, that's the way most people think about it when they're looking at a cloud provider solution. Beyond that is software as a service. Now, software as a service, you may actually be more familiar with using than anything else. Because software as a service, all it is instead of you having to build your own application or buy an application and then run it on the hardware and stand it up and everything else, the app in the software as a service, it's already stood up. You are simply using the application. If you think of logging into Gmail, Yahoo, Outlook.com, or any online email service provider, that's basically you are a customer of that SaaS platform, right? The application is there. You're simply using it. And that could be true of anything else, even Facebook or YouTube. You're not having to stand up that infrastructure, but you can use it to upload your videos to, or upload your messages to, or upgrade, or be able to communicate with family members, friends, coworkers across the globe. You don't have to stand up your own infrastructure to do that. Instead, you're using the SaaS platform that's available, right? So it's already the application that's web enabled. It's already the application that's available so that you don't have to worry about. And again, that's Facebook, YouTube, or Google's responsibility. It's Microsoft's responsibility. All these applications are online. It's their responsibility for handling. All you have to worry about is leveraging the platform. And so that's where SaaS comes into play. Now, as we, again, focus back onto the cloud layers, you start thinking about that delegation, that management layer. That's where we start differentiating it, right? So you would have virtualization, server storage, networking. This would be managed by the vendor or the cloud provider, whereas you would manage the operating system, any middleware, runtimes, etc., right? Now, in a platform as a service, you have a management responsibility, the applications and the data, but everything underneath that is managed by the cloud provider. And when you are talking about software as a service, they manage all the back end. You don't even see it. You don't worry about it. You just access it, right? And so that's really the key. And so as you start thinking about how do I decide what type of services to leverage from a cloud provider? Well, when you do so, you have to think of it almost application by application. And you have to think about what do we need to manage? What will our applications let us delegate? Now, this can be very true, especially if you're buying an application from a third party or you're renting or leasing or subscribing to it. A lot of times they have certain requirements, and that will determine which ones of these cloud service providers services you may or may not be able to use. How do compliance requirements let us delegate? Now, the reality is in every IT organization is typically restricted by some sort of compliance requirements. Now, those tend to be pretty broad, but their legal teams and the organizations, they make their own decisions in regards to how to interpret some of those compliance regulations for their own protection. And this has to do with risk management and risk delegation, like trying to control that. How much we take on versus how much we're going to trust someone else with it. And, so that's where compliance agencies come into play. So that will also help you understand what you can and can't do. In addition do we have the right skill sets to manage it on our own? Some organizations are large enough where they have enough people to cover all these layers. And you know what? They don't need a cloud provider. Most organizations have gaps in some way, shape, or form. And so they have to decide, especially maybe it's not today, but tomorrow, what do they need to look like? And so that goes into their strategy, 3 to 5 years, maybe even 10 years. And so they start thinking about how much cloud, how much colo, how much local data center are they going to take on, because all of that involves capital expenses. And that's really fundamentally what it comes down to is money, right? How much am I going to pay someone versus how much am I keeping? Now, if I'm keeping it, there's a cost to keeping it, as well as there's a cost to taking it, to having someone else do it. So oftentimes, it used to be that people used to think, oh, cloud will be cheaper. Not necessarily, especially depending on what you're using. But there's other factors that you have to take into account, risk being one of them, your skill sets and your capabilities being another. And there's other ones, but I won't get into those. In addition, how much does each cost, right? There's going to be a cost to infrastructure as a service because you're taking on most of the responsibility versus like platform as a service. Now, sometimes that can be cheaper, but it just depends. It's a give and take, right? So you have to understand the pros and cons and what that cloud provider is providing, because in some instances it could be cheaper. Because you're taking advantage of that cloud provider's economy of scale. But again, most of the time an organization isn't looking at it through glasses with dollar signs. They're looking at it through a risk tolerance or a skilling or trying to delegate some of the management responsibilities to someone else, more so than them taking on that responsibility. So, this is something, a chart that I recommend you get familiar with. Every cloud provider has their own version of this, but roughly these are the layers that you're going to be dealing with as you start deciding how much of an application or how much of a cloud service you're looking to take. Now, as you start looking at what are some of the key characteristics of cloud computing, because I talked earlier about, you can stand up your own data center, but does that translate it to what the definition of cloud means? And not so much in the standpoint of like a Webster's dictionary type of definition, but more so about what do you expect from cloud versus what you expect by just standing stuff up. And one of them is, for example, on-demand self-service provisioning. And this allows you to be able to quickly stand up new infrastructure, new virtual machines, new applications very, very quickly without having to call someone and have them set it up for you. Okay. So that self-service is very important. So there's a lot of automation involved in there, because typically when you stand up virtualization, or your own data centers, everything's manual, right? You have to build everything yourself. But with this self-service, there's a lot of automation involved. And so that makes it very easy, and it speeds up the ability to stand things up quickly. In addition to that, broad network access. You're able to leverage networking across the internet. Many of these cloud providers have their own data centers with their own data backbones. And that can be huge, especially when it comes to like your data not having to always go over the internet, which can make a lot of companies nervous, but it's going behind a private back end. In addition to that, you're focusing more on, instead of individual servers, you're talking about pooled capacity, right? So you're renting a type of virtual machine or so much memory or so much compute, and then that's what you're paying for. You're not paying for individual sockets or individual processors if that are physical in the server. That's not the case. Additionally, the ability, and when you start thinking about that on demand, but the ability for resources to automatically grow and shrink is also a characteristic of cloud computing that's important to understand, because especially if you think of like a scenario where let's say a retail store is going into Black Friday, for example, that Black Friday weekend, and maybe normally they service 2,000 users pretty easily. Black Friday, it goes from 2,000 to 20,000 or 200,000, right? All of a sudden, what they were running their applications on may not be able to sustain that much increase in users and new customers that are trying to quickly access new deals and buy the toys or the electronics that they want on that day. So elasticity in cloud allows a company to rent basically automatically a significant amount of more capacity for that weekend, to support 200,000 users, just an example. And then after that Black Friday weekend, after Cyber Monday, be able to shrink back down. And now I'm not paying for the capacity to support 200,000 people. I'm paying for the capacity to support 20,000 people, right? And that can be a significant delta, right? I needed the expansion for a weekend because I made a lot of money, right? But I don't need that capacity on a normal basis. So that elasticity is an example of something that's unique to cloud computing. That makes it very affordable for organizations. Otherwise, they'd have to basically pay for that hardware to do the same thing and just let it sit there, and that's not efficient, right? So that's a common definition there. Additionally, is being able, because we're talking about switching from a capacity-based mentality for computing to a consumption-based. So I need to know how much compute, how much storage, how much electricity, how much networking I'm using, right? I need to know all that. So this is where you start thinking of it like a utility bill, right? You get a bill at the end of each month and it tells you exactly how much you spent, right? How much you consumed. And it's not how many racks or how many servers you consumed, but how many total compute cycles, right? That lowest common denominator, what you're actually trying to pay for and consume. So all of that is characteristics of cloud computing. So something to understand as you get into this in your career as well. Okay. Now, again, I mentioned some of these already, but these are the most popular cloud providers here. Is Amazon Web Services. Again, Amazon stood up their own data centers, and they were one of the first ones to really popularize the cloud concept. But beyond that, you have Microsoft Azure, especially, these two are sort of the powerhouses. And then you have Google Cloud as well. Now, these aren't the only ones. Again, there's Alibaba internationally, and there's many other cloud providers internationally that have a significant footprint and influence. But here in the United States, these are your big three. Now, there could be additional co-location providers and other cloud platforms, like, for instance, Oracle has their own cloud. And then you're going to get into specialized cloud, where it's not it's not a situation where they invite everybody. They only bring in people who are they're trying to service that for their specific product set. So it becomes more specialized after that. So why should you care? Well, because if you are on the IT journey and you're trying to, separate yourself from the rest, because IT can be very competitive, it's important to have the right level of certifications for each cloud vendor or cloud provider that's out there. And a lot of times you can specialize on just one of these vendors and be totally fine. You don't have to go chasing all of them. However, it's important to at least understand the others. A lot of times there's different terminology. The different companies are allowed to call their infrastructure, their solution, whatever they want. And so they change, there might be terminology differences between the same type of technology in AWS versus Azure. So understanding those differences is going to make it just more flexible for you to be able to quickly transition between those. And if you can get certified in the clouds that you primarily work on, that's only going to amplify your credibility, not only to your organization, but also to the market. And if you can increase your value to the market, then that's going to make you more valuable and put you in a position to make a lot more money than perhaps what you're making now. So I encourage you to always understand. Now, these aren't the only certifications from each of these vendors. A lot of times these vendors have established a ladder of certifications that you can go up on each rung, so to speak, of a ladder. And that'll just allow you to either have entry level certification, a base fundamental, or all the way up to an administrator, an engineer, an architect, a data engineer, specialist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite a big slew. So this is where it's important for you to understand what your career journey and what your certification journey is and what you're trying to accomplish. So I encourage you, check this out, and understand each of these, before you start going down the path of trying to get all of these certifications. All right. Now, if you're looking for help, feel free to reach out. That's why I'm helping a lot of my students with a career map, helping them understand, okay, which path should they take and which certifications should they just simply avoid, right? Because everyone has a different path and to get to where they're trying to go. So just putting that out there. Now, in addition, we'll just wrap this up. Again, recapping, cloud computing is really about leveraging a range of services from different businesses and individuals alike, right? Allowing for flexibility, cost savings, and efficiency. And really, I would add on to that the delegation of risk and risk management. How much are you willing to manage and take on versus how much do you want to pay someone else to do it? Okay. And if you really think about cloud and the data centers and whether you should run it, I would keep it that simple in logic. Is how much are you willing to take on yourself versus how much do you want to just pay someone to do it? Because we do that all the time, right? If we want a meal, we can choose to cook it ourselves, or we can go to a restaurant and have someone else cook it for us, and then we just enjoy the steak or the chicken wrap or the vegetable dish that if you're a vegan and vegetarian. You can take advantage of all of that, right? And so that's really the differences as you go through this, okay? So you want to find out more? Well, first, you can join us every Tuesday right here at 8 p.m. Eastern Live. I'm really trying to go live on couple different platforms, and so feel free to join us as I cover a different topic every single week. Really, the idea there is I'm building on top of one another for this series, and then after that, we'll be branching out to some other tech topics as well. If you're on Facebook, feel free to join our Facebook group where you're going to get access to lots of free training and technical training. So the link's right there. As well as if you're on YouTube, hey, like and subscribe if you really enjoyed this video and this live, and as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you want to find out more about how you can be successful in tech, join us and check us out on our website, experthats.com, where we are focused on training, and we're expanding our training catalog to be able to train on many more technical pieces, as well as we provide career training and mentoring to help you be able to focus in on where you want to go a lot quicker, and being able to reach out to someone that has been there and you can learn from is hopefully something that you're looking for and something that we would be more than happy to help you with. Okay. We are technical professionals. We've been doing this for a long time, and we're sharing our love and passions with you to help you grow your career as well. And if you want to learn more about how you can perhaps build your own lab, I'm including here a link on how to install the VMware Workstation Pro and be able to build 2 Windows 11 virtual machines, all completely free on your own lab, on your own hardware. So check us out here at go.experthats.com/free-build your lab. And check out all the instructions on how to do that. All right. And so with that, I definitely want to thank you very much for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you in our next live. Take care.